Hello, everyone. My name is Daniela Pera, and today I will be covering the No Child Left Behind Act. Throughout this presentation, I will make sure that I explain what an educational reform is and how it affects children and how we can use these to educate children in general education and in other aspects such as education and law. So, to really understand how the law affects the education in children, it is very important to understand what role the law plays in the education system overall. So, what I would like to cover first is what is the law when it comes to the education reforms or education in general. So, American laws mandate that every child is given the opportunity to access and have education. The education law also involve a diverse range of issues from representing children with poor access to education to special education such as law education reform. Also, I would like to cover why is the law important and how it affects the education system. So litigation, legislation, and policy changes have been driving the school reform for the past few decades. And these reforms have a very particular connection when it comes to measuring student progress, as well as bullying rates and the development of all alternatives to public schools. Many of these education reforms efforts have occurred on the state level. For example, all states except Montana have enacted the anti-bullying laws, and 12 states include a criminal sanction for bullies in their laws. Also, charter school laws allowing the creation of charter schools throughout the state have been enacted in 42 states and the District of Columbia. The specific content of the charter school law affects how successful any given charter school in that state is. States also led the standard and accountability movement of the 1990s, which led to the creation and writing of the Common Core standards. And these are standards outlining what students are expected to know or do at each grade level. Assessment measures were also created corporately by state and implemented at the state level to measure whether students met these Common Core standards. However, since the education system is ruled by every state has different education reforms, and all these educations in law vary from state to state. Now that we've covered a little bit of the legislation of every single education law in the country, we're gonna be focusing on the No Child Left Behind Act. So the No Child Left Behind Act is an act by Congress, and it's aimed at improving school performance by increasing the standards of accountability for states, school districts, and schools, as well as providing parents with more flexibility in choosing which schools their children will attend. This act was revolutionary as now parents and students were able to see technically which in a standard way school was better for them and for their goals. This act also promoted an increased focus in reading and reauthorized the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965. And just a little background on what the Secondary Education Act of 1965 was. It was a cornerstone of President Lyndon B. Johnson on the war of poverty. And this law brought education into the forefront of the national assault on poverty and represented a landmark commitment to equal access to quality education. Therefore, the No Child Left Behind kind of reauthorized and brought that back in order to continue fighting poverty and letting every child have a quality education accessible. All right, but going back to the No Child Left Behind Act, this act also enacts the theories of a standard-based education reform, which is based on the belief that setting high expectations and establishing measurable goals can improve an individual outcome in education. This act requires states to develop assessments in basic skills to be given to all students at a certain grade level. So for example, in first grade, there's a specific standardized that every single child should be able to pass. And that's how we know that every child is getting quality education and of course is accessible. However, it is important to know that the No Child Left Behind does not assert a national achievement standard. It is more every single state sets their own standard. So now that we've covered what the No Child Left Behind Act is, it is important to also point out the psychological research behind it to really know if this is a reform that has helped or it hasn't helped what it was supposed to. So because this reform was introduced simultaneously throughout the United States, many observers do say that it's a little difficult to assess its impact. Further, data on national trends in student achievement from 1992 to 2007 suggests that the No Child Left Behind Act may have increased the math performance of fourth graders. That is, these NAEP, or the National Assessment of Educational Progress data, suggests that fourth graders' math achievement has shifted noticeable higher during the No Child Left Behind era and might have also begun trending upward more aggressively. Also, the trend data also suggests similar gains in the math performance of Black eighth graders. Also, during the same research conducted by the Center of Education and Policy in 2008, another thing that was noticeable was the achievement growth for 9 and 13-year-olds in math and reading using data from the long-term trend and APD, which has tracked student performance from the early 1970s. And this data similarly suggests that the effects of No Child Left Behind on a student achievement has been at best limited to certain groups. So after reviewing the psychological research behind it and what the actual reform is defined as and what constitutes the actual reform, another question that we could ask is it effective? So if you were to ask me, I do think that this reform was effective as it added structure to the educational programs nationwide. Also, I think it was assertive in the sense that it held teachers and administrators accountable for the students' performance. And the socioeconomic gaps had less influence with this legislation, of course, because the point of this reform was to make quality education accessible to everyone, regardless of their socioeconomic statuses. And lastly, the teacher qualifications were emphasized during the No Child Left Behind Act, considering that it became a more standard way of doing things. Therefore, if it were for me to answer this question, whether it was effective or not, I do think it was effective. Of course, we do have a lot to reform and work on as we progress through the education system to lower the inequality. But I do think that the No Child Left Behind Act was a huge step when it came to equity in education. And that'll be everything for my presentation today. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you learned something about the No Child Left Behind Act.